Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to this program, Grace Slick.
There is a photograph that still circulates from the early morning hours of Woodstock, 1969. A woman in a white dress standing at the edge of a stage soaked in fog and exhaustion, staring out at hundreds of thousands of people who had been awake far too long. That woman greeted the crowd by promising them maximum morning maniac music, and then she delivered it. Most performers who reach that kind of moment spend the rest of their lives trying to get back to it. Grace Slick spent the rest of her life trying to get away from it. Today, at 86 years old, she has finally said something that has quieted even her most devoted fans. Not a grand confession, not a tearful apology, but something far rarer from her. A plain, unguarded admission about who she has become. To understand why that admission landed so hard, you have to go back to where she started, because almost nothing about Grace Slick's beginning suggested she would end up anywhere near a psychedelic revolution. Grace Barnett Wing was born on October 30, 1939, in Highland Park, Illinois, a well-kept suburb north of Chicago built for families who valued order and appearances. Her father worked in investment banking. Her mother had once sung professionally before setting that life aside for marriage and motherhood, the way many women of that generation were expected to. When Grace was still young, the family relocated to Palo Alto, California, trading one comfortable manicured community for another. By her own later description, her upbringing resembled a black-and-white television sitcom, tidy, predictable, and thoroughly respectable. There was even a genealogical detail that made the eventual contrast almost too perfect to invent. Her family's roots reportedly traced back to passengers on the Mayflower. The woman who would later become one of the loudest voices of the counterculture came from a lineage of Puritans. She attended Finch College in New York, an institution built to polish young women for marriage rather than careers, and later spent time at the University of Miami. None of it particularly moved her. By the late 1950s, she had stepped into exactly the kind of life her upbringing had been designed to produce. She worked as a model at I. Magnin, a fashionable department store in San Francisco, walking the kind of runway shows that rewarded composure over expression. In 1961, she married Jerry Slick in a small ceremony, a match that made sense on paper. He was the son of her mother's closest friend, and marrying him was simply what a young woman from her background did next. For a while, Grace lived the life she had been raised to want. She modeled, she kept a home, she followed the script. But something about that script never fit right. The 1950s version of womanhood promised comfort in exchange for obedience, the correct shoes, the correct posture, the correct ambitions, all measured against a narrow idea of what a woman was allowed to want. Grace later admitted that even footwear came loaded with judgment back then. Heels were required, but not too high, not too bold. Somewhere beneath the surface of that tidy life, she held on to a suspicion that there had to be something else. She found an unlikely kindred spirit in a children's book character, Alice, from Lewis Carroll's Wonderland. Grace often pointed out the parallel herself. Alice had grown up in a rigid Victorian world full of rules about behavior and place. Grace had grown up in a 1950s American version of the same thing. What drew her to Alice wasn't the whimsy of the story. It was that Alice never waited for anyone to save her. She simply walked through the door and figured out the rest on her own terms. That instinct would define nearly everything Grace Slick did for the next 6 decades. By 1965, the quiet life had cracked open. Grace, her husband Jerry, and Jerry's brother Darby formed a band called The Great Society. That same year, Grace went to see a rising local group called Jefferson Airplane perform, and she walked away with a very direct thought. She believed she could do what that lead singer was doing, and she suspected she could do it while making better money. History would prove her right on both counts. In the transition between 1965 and 1966, the Great Society recorded 2 songs that would eventually reshape American music. One, Somebody to Love, was written by Darby Slick. The other came from Grace. She has said she wrote it in roughly an hour, seated at a battered red upright piano she'd bought secondhand, an instrument missing close to 10 working keys. That song was White Rabbit. What made the song land the way it did wasn't length or complexity. It ran barely 2.5 minutes and never bothered with a traditional chorus. Instead, It built with the steady tightening pressure of a Spanish-style march, climbing without release, until it arrived at a single unforgettable command. Grace had been listening obsessively to Miles Davis's Sketches of Spain and Ravel's Bolero around that time, and she wanted to capture that same hypnotic, slow-burning ascent in a pop song. She used the imagery of Alice in Wonderland as scaffolding for something much less innocent: pills that make you larger, mushrooms that make you smaller, a white rabbit worth chasing, turning a Victorian children's story into a coded map of the psychedelic experience. For years afterward, Grace liked to point out that Lewis Carroll's original text was already dense with drug-adjacent imagery, and that generations of parents had read it to their children without ever noticing. There was also a sharper argument buried in the song, one Grace articulated more than once in later interviews. She believed the generation that survived World War II had raised their children on stories built entirely around escape and altered states: Alice's rabbit hole, Peter Pan's flight from growing up, Dorothy's tornado into Oz. And then reacted with shock when those same children grew up wanting a real doorway into an altered state of mind. White Rabbit, in her telling, wasn't a rebellion against that generation so much as a mirror held up to their own contradictions. In 1966, Cyrus-era lineup changes at Jefferson Airplane opened a door. The band's original female vocalist, Signe Tolley Anderson, was leaving to raise a newborn, and Grace stepped in to replace. She brought both songs with her. The following year, they appeared on the album Surrealistic Pillow, and both Somebody to Love and White Rabbit climbed into the national top 10. The record became one of the defining artifacts of what would soon be called the Summer of Love, and Grace Slick, at 27, became one of the first genuine female rock stars America had produced, a woman with a commanding contralto voice and a stage presence the industry had no existing template for. Her former bandmate and one-time partner Paul Kantner once compared her cultural impact to that of Oscar Wilde, only half joking. And yet, almost from the beginning, Grace refused to treat the song with any reverence. For decades afterward, she insisted, "White Rabbit simply wasn't very good writing." Her standard was blunt: a lyric either worked or it didn't, and in her assessment, hers didn't fully land. She has said she believed she could have written better words for it. That opinion never softened, not after the royalties, not after the induction ceremonies, not after it became one of the most recognized songs of its era. It's a strange kind of footnote to a legendary career, a woman who wrote an anthem in under an hour and then spent 50 years describing it like an unfinished rough draft. Grace Slick didn't observe the late 1960s from a comfortable distance. She stood inside its most consequential moments, close enough to feel the temperature change in real time. At Woodstock in August 1969, Jefferson Airplane took the stage after an agonizing delay, playing to a crowd that had been awake for the better part of 2 days. Grace greeted them with a line about maximum morning maniac music, and the performance became one of the festival's most remembered sets. 4 months later, the mood turned. In December 1969, Jefferson Airplane played the Altamont Speedway Free Festival, an event billed as the West Coast's answer to Woodstock. Security had been handed informally to the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, reportedly compensated in beer rather than cash, and the atmosphere soured almost immediately. During the Airplane set, singer Marty Balin was knocked unconscious on stage by one of the Angels in full view of the crowd. Surviving recordings capture Grace at the microphone attempting to calm the audience, repeating pleas to cool out as the chaos spread around her. It didn't work. Later that day, during the Rolling Stones performance, a young concert-goer named Meredith Hunter was fatally stabbed near the stage. For much of the country, Altamont marked the moment the idealism of the decade curdled into something darker, and Grace Slick had a front-row seat to both the dream and its collapse, 4 months apart. That proximity shaped how she talked about the era for the rest of her life. She rarely romanticized the 1960s the way later documentaries and retrospectives tended to. She had lived the unfiltered version, not the nostalgic one, and it left her with little patience for sentimentality about a decade she remembered as messier and more dangerous than its reputation suggested. Then there's the story that sounds almost too outlandish to be true, except that Grace told it, in detail, on multiple occasions over the following decades. In 1969, she received an invitation to a tea reception at the White House, hosted by Tricia Nixon, the president's daughter, the connection being that both women had attended Finch College, and the event was tied to a school reunion. Grace decided to go. She also decided to bring a guest, Abby Hoffman, the countercultural activist and co-founder of the Yippies, a man about as far from a typical White House tea guest as could be imagined. According to Grace's own retelling, she planned to slip a large dose of LSD, allegedly around 600 micrograms, into President Nixon's teacup, having hidden the powdered drug beneath one of her fingernails. Security recognized her name at the entrance and turned both her and Hoffman away before they ever got near the reception. She later speculated she'd likely been flagged because of her politics and associations. It's an audacious story, one she never tried to sand down into something more palatable, and she told it with the same unbothered honesty that defined most of her public statements, including admitting she couldn't say for certain the plan would have worked, even if she'd made it inside. For all the wit and bravado, Grace Slick's story includes a stretch of real darkness, and she has never tried to disguise it. For close to 2 decades, she struggled with severe alcoholism, a problem that worsened as her fame grew rather than easing alongside it. There were arrests, there were shows where she appeared too intoxicated to function, and audiences who watched her rock legend visibly unraveling in real time. A particularly chaotic performance in Germany in 1978 became something of a breaking point, contributing to tension that eventually pushed her out of Jefferson Starship, the band's later incarnation. She has talked about those years with a bluntness that avoids self-pity almost entirely. She has described crashing cars, showing up too impaired to sing properly, and being, by her own account, exceptionally difficult to work alongside. One frequently retold episode involves a standoff at her home that escalated to the point of armed police response, the kind of incident that, for most public figures, would have ended a career outright. Grace has recounted it without flinching and without dressing it up as some kind of meaningful turning point. In her own framing, it was simply a reckless period that went on far too long before it finally stopped. Her personal life moved through comparable turbulence. She divorced Jerry Slick in 1971. That same year, she had a daughter, China Kantner, with her Jefferson Airplane bandmate Paul Kantner. Before the birth, when asked what she might name the child, Grace reportedly joked she'd consider naming her God with a lowercase g, so the girl wouldn't grow up with an inflated sense of self. The name on the birth certificate ended up being far more conventional. China would later carve out her own public career as an MTV video jockey and actress. In 1976, Grace married Skip Johnson, a lighting director who worked with Jefferson Starship. That marriage lasted considerably longer than her first, but ultimately ended in 1994. Behind the public bravado sat real despair as well. Grace has spoken about a period involving suicidal crisis, and by the grim statistical pattern that claims so many of her contemporaries, she was, by most measures, not expected to make it to old age. Janis Joplin died at 27. Jimi Hendrix died at 27. A striking number of Grace's peers and friends from that era never got the chance to grow older at all. Somehow, against those odds, she did. Around 1990 or 1991, at nearly the same moment she chose to leave music behind entirely, Grace also got sober. She has stayed sober for decades since, and she rarely dresses that decision up with any dramatic narrative arc. In her telling, there was no single cinematic rock-bottom moment, no elaborate spiritual awakening, just a clear-eyed recognition that she'd already experienced everything that lifestyle had to offer and simply no longer wanted it. The same decisiveness that let her walk away from a chart-topping band eventually helped her walk away from the drinking too. If anything defines the second half of Grace Slick's public story, it's the sheer unlikeliness of her exit. In 1985, fronting Starship, she landed a #1 single with "We Built This City." At 46 years old, she became the oldest woman to sing lead vocals on a Billboard Hot 100 chart topper at that point. Starship kept climbing from there, eventually notching 3 #1 singles within about 2 years, including Sarah and Nothing's Gonna Stop Us Now. Commercially, This was the peak of her career. She was also, by then, roughly a decade older than most of her bandmates, and that gap seemed to sharpen rather than soften her resolve to stop. In 1988, she left Starship. After a brief, short-lived reunion with the classic Jefferson Airplane lineup in 1989, she retired from music altogether in 1990. Her reasoning was pure Grace Slick. She believed rock and roll was fundamentally a young person's art form, built on sex, defiance, and raw physical energy, and that once age eroded that energy, the performance itself became something else, something she had no interest in delivering. She had no desire to stand in front of an audience decades later, performing White Rabbit as a nostalgia act. She essentially set her own retirement age at 50, a standard she held to with unusual consistency in an industry that increasingly built its business model around legacy artists touring well into their 70s and 80s. Crucially, she never carved out an exception for herself. The rule she set applied to her own life exactly as strictly as she applied it in interviews. And she kept that promise. No reunion tour followed. No lucrative farewell circuit materialized once the money got tempting enough. Decade after decade, offers to return presumably kept coming, the way they do for anyone with a signature hit and a built-in audience, and she turned all of them down. That kind of discipline is rare in an industry engineered to pull retired stars back under the lights one more time. Grace Slick simply never went back. In 1993, disaster struck in a different form. Grace's home in Marin County burned down, reportedly the result of an accident involving a nearby road crew. The fire destroyed the bulk of her possessions, along with a significant portion of her music memorabilia, decades of physical history gone in a matter of hours. Around the same period, her second marriage was unraveling as well. She relocated south to Malibu, and in the wreckage of that transitional stretch, she picked up a paintbrush, largely as a form of therapy. What began as a coping mechanism eventually became the defining work of the second half of her life. Grace Slick has now spent roughly 3 decades as a professional visual artist, longer at this point than her entire music career lasted. Her paintings and prints have shown in galleries around the United States, and her work has appeared at auction in limited editions. Fittingly, some of those pieces even incorporate lyrics from the very song she has spent 50 years insisting wasn't especially well written. The subject matter she returns to most often says a great deal about her. Alice in Wonderland remains a constant thread, and above all, the White Rabbit itself, a figure that effectively became her personal emblem. She has also painted portraits of friends who didn't survive the era she did: Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, Jerry Garcia, a body of work that carries an unmistakable weight, given how narrowly Grace herself avoided joining that list. She's refreshingly unpretentious about her own artistic identity. She has said she doesn't work in a single recognizable style, estimating she moves across something like 15 different approaches, which apparently frustrates gallery representatives who'd prefer an artist with one consistent, marketable look. She's never been interested in settling into that kind of signature. She's spoken about her process in